The snow had begun to fall early that evening, soft at first, then thick and heavy, as if London itself wanted to bury its noise beneath a white silence. In the tall Georgian townhouse on Kensington Road, the lights glowed gold behind the long windows. Inside, a dinner was ending, laughter, fine wine, the sound of silver cutlery against porcelain. Yet at the head of the table, Edward Shaw, the man who owned half the logistics terminals along the Thames, sat unmoved. He should have felt pride. Wealth, recognition, a seat on every board that mattered. But all he felt was a strange distance. The older he got, the quieter it was inside his head, and the louder the small things became. A pair of shoes neatly placed by the kitchen door, the hum of the old radio in the servants' hall, and Grace Miller, the cleaner who never looked him in the eye. Grace had been working in the house for 6 months. Punctual, polite, almost invisible. Almost. She never joined the small staff dinners, never accepted leftovers from the chef, and always left right on time. But tonight, something caught Edward's attention. As the party guests began to leave, Grace quietly packed pieces of the untouched roast turkey and vegetables into a small container, wrapped it in foil, and slipped it into her old satchel. It wasn't theft. It was something else, something careful, almost reverent. Edward found himself watching without knowing why. When she left through the back door, snow gathering on her coat, he stood by the window for a long minute. Then, on an impulse he couldn't explain, he put on his overcoat, stepped out into the street, and followed her. The city changed as he walked, from elegant Kensington facades to streets that grew narrower, older, quieter. The pavements were slick, the lamps weaker. Grace's figure ahead moved with purpose, head down, both hands clutching the satchel close. She crossed a bridge, not the kind with tourists and Christmas lights, but one that smelled of river rust and cold metal. Edward slowed, afraid she might notice him, but she never turned. Finally, she disappeared into a block of aging flats on the edge of Peckham. From the street, he saw her climb the stairs, open a door, and light spilled out from a single bulb. What Edward saw inside froze him where he stood. 3 small children sat on the floor, waiting in excitement. Grace knelt beside them, unpacked the containers, and laid the food carefully on mismatched plates, like a feast. The children clapped, laughing. She raised a plastic cup and said softly, "Merry Christmas, my loves." Edward turned away. For the first time in years, he felt something break open inside him. Not guilt, but recognition. And that night, he knew sleep would not come easily again. The next morning, London woke under a thin layer of frost. Edward sat in his study, staring at the untouched coffee on his desk. He had not told a soul what he'd seen the night before. Not his assistant, not even his driver. The image of that small flat wouldn't leave him. The plastic cups, the way Grace smiled, not with embarrassment, but with a kind of quiet pride. And those children, 3 of them, barely 5 years old, laughing as if their world had everything it needed. He should have forgotten. But the more he tried to return to spreadsheets and meetings, the more his mind slipped back to that window in Peckham. By noon, a strange thought took hold. He opened his drawer, pulled out a blank card from last year's Christmas stationery, and began to write. "Grace, I saw something last night that I had no right to see. But perhaps it was meant to happen. You made me realize that love can exist even when there's nothing left to give. Please, let this make things a little lighter. E." He read it twice. It felt foolish, sentimental even. But it was honest. For a man who had built his empire on precision and silence, that honesty scared him more than any business risk ever had. He slipped the card into an envelope, along with something else. A bank card in her name, preloaded with enough money to cover rent for a year. He didn't sign his surname, didn't seal it with any mark of wealth. Just initials and a decision that didn't make sense to anyone, not even to himself. That evening, while the household staff were finishing up, he placed the envelope in Grace's locker, then walked away before anyone could see. When Grace found it, her hands trembled. She looked around, but the corridor was empty. She tore it open, her eyes widening as she read the note. The card slid into her palm, weightless and impossible. For a long moment she stood there, heart racing, breath shallow. Was it pity? A trap? Some cruel joke? But the handwriting, it wasn't cold. It was careful, almost uncertain. Grace folded the letter, slipped it into her coat, and left without a word. That night, while her children slept, she sat by the small window, the card lying on the table before her. For years, she had fought to keep pride and survival balanced on the same thread. Now, someone had seen behind the curtain, and she didn't know whether to be afraid or relieved. Outside, snow began to fall again. And far away in a house where every light could be turned on by voice command, Edward Shaw stared out at the same snow, wondering if kindness could ever be done without making someone feel small. 3 days passed before they saw each other again. The holidays were over and London had returned to its grey rhythm. Buses, sirens, the clatter of shoes on wet pavements. Inside the townhouse, Christmas decorations were being taken down. Grace worked quietly in the library, wiping dust from the tall shelves. She thought she was alone until a reflection in the glass made her stop. Edward was standing by the door, hands in his pockets, watching. Neither spoke at first. The hum of the radiator filled the silence. "Did you receive the card?" he asked finally, his voice quieter than she remembered. Grace froze. She turned, the cloth still in her hand. "Yes," she said. "I did." "Did you use it?" "No." "Why not?" She hesitated. Her voice came out low, almost trembling. "Because I don't understand what you want from me." Edward took a breath. "Nothing. He stopped, searching for words. "I saw something that reminded me what being human looks like. And I couldn't ignore it." Grace looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since she had started working there. The man who had always seemed made of marble suddenly looked tired, not cruel, not cold, just lost. She folded the cleaning cloth, placed it neatly on the card and said, "The world you live in doesn't fit with mine, Mr. Shaw. You can't fix it with a card." "I'm not trying to fix it." He smiled faintly. "I'm just trying not to pretend anymore." For a second their eyes met, hers cautious, his uncertain. Then she nodded slightly, almost as if accepting that he meant it, but not ready to trust it yet. When she left the room, Edward stood there for a long while, staring at the empty doorway. Something in her words stayed with him. The world you live in doesn't fit with mine. It was true. But he found himself wondering if perhaps the world could be rearranged. That night he drafted a new employment agreement, flexible hours, higher pay, childcare consideration, and left it unsigned on his desk. He wasn't sure if it was charity or justice, but it felt like a start. Meanwhile, in her small flat, Grace sat by the window again, the card still untouched. She thought about the man who had followed her, and the strange gentleness in his eyes. For the first time in years, she whispered to herself, "Maybe not everyone looks away." The first Monday of the new year arrived with a soft drizzle that turned the snow into dirty slush. Grace left her flat early, the twins still asleep and the eldest drawing on scraps of paper by the heater. Her neighbor, Mrs. Harland, waved from her door, the smell of tea drifting into the corridor. "Long day again, dear?" Grace nodded with a tired smile. "Always." At the same hour, a quiet conversation took place in another part of London. Edward sat in his office, reviewing numbers that meant nothing. On his desk lay the unsigned employment form,
and a sealed envelope. He didn't open it. He just looked at it for a long while before saying to his assistant, "Send a van to this address, leave the boxes, no note, no name." 2 days later, a white delivery van stopped outside Grace's building in Peckham.
The driver checked the label twice, shrugged and began unloading boxes. Not new, but carefully chosen. A small bookshelf, a heater, blankets, books, toys, and a set of second-hand chairs polished to a soft shine. Grace came down the stairs, alarmed. "Excuse me, there must be a mistake." "No mistake, love," said the driver. "Address matches. Merry late Christmas, I guess." And before she could ask more, he was gone. She stood in the cold street, raindrops catching in her hair, staring at the stack of boxes. The children pressed their faces against the window above, waving, shouting, "Mum! Look!" For a moment, she didn't move. Then she noticed something. Taped to the side of one of the boxes, a scrap of paper torn from an envelope, with only 5 words written in blue ink. "For warmth, not pity. E." Her knees nearly gave out. She carried the boxes upstairs one by one, tears mixing with the rain. Inside, Mrs. Harland appeared with her old shopping trolley, insisting on helping. "If that's not a good angel, then I don't know what is," she whispered with a grin. That evening, when the flat was full of laughter and cardboard scraps, Grace sat quietly by the door. She wanted to feel joy, but all she felt was a deep ache, the kind that comes when life finally stops fighting back. In Kensington, Edward stood at his office window, the city stretching out below him.
He had done the one thing he'd sworn never to do again, act on emotion. But this time it didn't feel like weakness, it felt like breathing. He didn't know if Grace had guessed it was him. He didn't need her to. All he wanted was to give a little peace to a woman who carried too much. Outside, the rain turned back into snow, small, quiet, stubborn flakes, like the start of something that didn't yet have a name. By mid-January, the townhouse on Kensington Road had returned to its usual rhythm, polished floors, quiet corridors, and the scent of cedar wax. But for Edward Shaw, nothing truly returned to normal. He noticed things he had never cared for before. The tired hands of the kitchen staff, the sound of Grace's footsteps on the back stairs, the way the house felt too large, too silent. One evening, as he reviewed a report in the library, he heard someone stacking books behind him. Grace again.
She was wearing her navy blue uniform, sleeves rolled up, hair tied neatly back. She moved like someone who had made peace with exhaustion. "Grace," he said suddenly, without turning around. She stopped. "Sir?" He turned, resting the papers on the table. "Did you ever find out who sent those things to your flat?" Her face stilled. She met his gaze, quiet but steady. "I did. Or rather, I think I did. And I decided not to ask why." Edward nodded slowly. "You could have. Most people would. I'm not most people." Her lips curved faintly, though not quite into a smile. "People like me learn not to question miracles. They don't come twice." Something in her tone, not gratitude, not defiance, but calm truth, unsettled him. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think it was a miracle?" "I think it was a mistake, someone trying to fix something they didn't break." He inhaled sharply, the air thick between them. "Then let me ask you something else." She waited. "Do you ever get tired of pretending you're fine?" For a moment her eyes flickered, and he saw it. The years of holding everything together, the quiet endurance that made pity an insult. "Yes," she whispered. "But tired doesn't change the bills." Edward wanted to say something, anything, that would make it easier. But all he managed was, "You shouldn't have to carry it alone." Grace picked up the stack of books again. Maybe not, but carrying it makes me who I am. And with that, she left the room. He stood in silence for a long time, her words echoing in his mind. Carrying it makes me who I am. Later that night, he found himself writing again. Not a letter this time, but a contract amendment. He added one line at the bottom. Flexible hours, priority for family. He didn't sign it yet. He wanted to hand it to her himself. To look her in the eyes and tell her that sometimes miracles don't have to vanish after the first time. Outside, London's lights flickered in the mist. Inside, for the first time in years, Edward felt like he was waiting for something real. It was a Thursday evening when Edward found himself standing by the back entrance of the house, a place he had never lingered before. The evening shift was ending. Footsteps echoed along the corridor, coats were buttoned, doors clicked shut. And then she appeared. Grace. Her hair pulled up, face pale with the day's exhaustion. She stopped the moment she saw him leaning against the doorway, hands in his coat pockets. Are you waiting for someone? She asked, half curious, half guarded. Yes, he said after a pause. You. She frowned. Why? If I said I didn't know, would you believe me? Her eyes softened slightly, but her voice stayed measured. You never wait for anyone, Mr. Shaw. Maybe I've never had a reason to. The words hung in the air like frost. She looked away first. I live a long way from here. I don't mind walking. He said it simply, not as an offer, but as a quiet decision. She hesitated, then nodded. They stepped into the cold night together. London, after hours, was different. The rush gone, the lights muted, puddles glistening like mirrors of old secrets. They walked in silence past shuttered shops and the river's faint glow. At first she kept a polite distance. Then slowly it closed, not in inches but in rhythm. Their footsteps began to fall in sync. He asked softly, Do your children know what you do? They know I clean houses, she said. They think every house smells like Christmas. He smiled faintly. That sounds like a better world. She looked up at him, a mixture of weariness and quiet defiance in her face. Don't make it sound noble. It's just survival. I wasn't talking about you, he said. I meant them. They stopped in front of her building. An old brick block with a flickering hallway light. She turned, holding her keys tightly. This is my world, she said. He nodded. Then this is where I'd like to step in. She blinked, uncertain if she had heard right. Mr. Shaw? Edward? He corrected softly. Just Edward. She didn't invite him in, but she didn't stop him either. They climbed the stairs slowly, the walls echoing with the hum of the old heater. When the door opened, 3 small faces peeked out, wide-eyed, cautious. Grace knelt. This is my boss, she said gently. One of the children grinned. The man who sent the toys. Edward froze. Grace exhaled, smiling despite herself. Yes, that's him. The youngest handed him a small wooden car. Do you want to play? He crouched, the polished shoes creaking softly. I'd like that. And for the first time in years, Edward Shaw, the man who could buy anything, realized that what he truly wanted was something no money could ever touch. By February, the story had begun to travel, quietly like smoke through closed doors. Staff whispered in hallways, drivers exchanged knowing looks, and someone from the office claimed to have seen Edward Shaw walking through Peckham one night. It was, of course, nonsense, or so people said. But gossip has a way of filling the gaps that truth leaves behind. Grace felt it first. The glances that lingered too long, the half smiles, the careful tone people used when speaking to her. Even Hannah, the head housekeeper, kind but sharp, looked at her differently. That afternoon, while Grace polished the silver trays in the kitchen, Hannah approached her. People talk, Grace, she said softly. Don't let them get to you. But also, be careful. Grace nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "I didn't ask for any of this," she murmured. "I know," Anna replied. "That's what makes it real." Upstairs, Edward was facing his own version of the storm. The company board had begun to question his recent distractions. A director even hinted at a press leak. This could become a scandal, he warned. A billionaire and his cleaner. That's not charity anymore. That's a headline. Edward leaned back, unflinching. "Then let them write it," he said, "and there's no shame in caring for someone who's fought harder than I ever had to." The room fell silent. The director swallowed, unable to respond. That evening, Grace went to the library, determined to end the uncertainty. She found Edward alone, the contract she'd seen once before now signed and lying on the desk. "I can leave," she said quietly. "If this is causing trouble..." He looked up immediately. "No, you leaving would cause trouble. I can't keep pretending none of this is happening." "Then don't," he said simply. "Come with me." Her breath caught. "Where?" "Wherever you want. As long as we stop hiding." She looked at him, the weight of years in her eyes. "I'll come," she said. "Only if we build something new. Not your world or mine, but something between them." He reached across the desk and touched her hand for the first time. No grand gesture, just a quiet truth resting between two people who had run out of pretense. Downstairs, Hannah passed the doorway and caught sight of them, and for the first time, she smiled. Not in judgment, but in relief. Sometimes, she thought, kindness deserves to win, even if the world calls it scandal. Outside, the snow was almost gone. The city was grey again, but inside that room, something had finally begun to grow. Fragile, real, and unstoppable. Spring came slowly that year. The frost retreated from the streets, the air smelled faintly of rain and fresh bread from the corner bakery, and somewhere on the quiet edge of London, in a modest red brick house with peeling white shutters, laughter had finally returned. Grace's children filled the place with life. Crayons on the table, muddy shoes by the door, drawings taped to every wall. Edward had insisted they move somewhere larger, but Grace had chosen this house herself. Big enough to breathe, small enough to care, she'd said. He traded his tailored suits for linen shirts, learned to cook on Sundays, and began every morning with the sound of small feet running across the floorboards. The children called him Edward for a while, until the day the youngest fell in the garden, scraped his knee and cried out through his tears, "Dad!" Edward froze. Grace came running, but before she could speak, Edward knelt, cleaned the wound carefully, and looked up at her with a trembling smile. "It's all right," he whispered. "He was right to call me that." From then on, Dad stayed, not because of titles or paper, but because it fit, as naturally as the sound of laughter through an open window. Years passed. Grace found steady work as a coordinator for the Shaw Foundation, a small charity Edward started to support single parents who had nowhere else to turn. Her days were still long, but no longer heavy. And Edward, once the man who could buy silence, now spent his time learning noise, the kind that fills a home. On the twins' graduation day, the hall was packed. Grace sat in the front row, her dress simple, her eyes full of pride. Edward, his hair now silver, sat beside her, clutching a small handkerchief he'd sworn he wouldn't need. When their daughter Lily stepped up to the microphone to give the closing speech, her voice wavered, but only for a second. "I don't remember much from when I was little," she began. "But I remember Mom cooking from scraps and making it taste like magic. And I remember the night a stranger appeared and never left. We don't choose how we start, but we can choose how we end. And I chose to call him Dad." The audience applauded, but Edward barely heard it. His throat tightened, his hands shook. Grace took his hand and he didn't hide the tears anymore. Later, as the sun set over the city, they returned to their home, smaller than the one he once owned, yet richer than anything he'd ever built. Grace baked bread while the children teased him about burning the toast. He looked around, the old bookshelf, the faint hum of the kettle, the laughter that rose and fell like music. He thought about the night years ago, the snow, the window, the woman kneeling beside 3 children, and how it had broken something inside him. Only now did he realize it hadn't broken him. It had opened him. And as he stood there, a man no longer chasing numbers but moments, he whispered to himself, "I thought I was saving her, but she saved me first." Outside, the evening light brushed against the windows, soft and golden. Inside, a family sat down to dinner. Not perfect, not polished, but real. And somewhere deep within that fragile, ordinary warmth, Edward Shaw, the man who once measured life by profit, finally found the only kind of wealth that lasts, the kind you can't count, only feel.